Welcome in. We are so thrilled to have you joining us for another deep dive into the materials you've sent our way. Today we are looking at something that affects literally every single decision you make, every interaction you have, every gut feeling you experience, even though you are, by definition, completely unaware of it happening.
Right, it's a huge claim to make right out of the gate.
It is. But the source material for today backs it up. It's a truly phenomenal recording of a university psychology lecture. And I want to set the table right away here. This isn't some, dry, dusty academic reading where someone drones on about dates and dead theorists.
No, not at all. It's incredibly dynamic.
Exactly. This lecture takes Sigmund Freud's classic theories of motivation and development and violently collides them with hardcore modern scientific evidence. It is a full-scale exploration into the deeply unsettling idea that we rarely know what is actually going on inside our own heads.
It's a remarkable piece of audio, particularly in how it bridges two worlds that historically, well, they despised each other. Our primary mission for this deep dive is to unpack the hidden architecture of the mind. For the better part of a century, there has been a brutal, entrenched debate within the field of psychology.
Oh, absolutely brutal.
On one side of the chasm, you have the Freudian unconscious, the realm of hidden drives, repressed desires, psychic energy, stuff that dominated the early 20th century. And on the other side, you have modern experimental psychology, which demanded measurable, quantifiable, observable data.
Right, the guys in the white lab coats.
Precisely. And we are going to explore whether that Freudian unconscious is just a historical quirk, a relic from a bygone era of cigars and therapy couches, or if it's a scientifically measurable reality that is actively dictating how you, the listener, are living your daily life right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the way this lecture frames that historical tension is just brilliant. It doesn't just hand you a textbook definition. It drags you from the old school, slightly mysterious image of a patient free associating on a psychoanalyst's couch straight into a modern neuroscience lab where researchers are tracking sweat gland responses. It really promises to deliver some serious aha moments about the bizarre machinery driving our behavior.
It really does. What's fascinating here is the sheer tension between what we consciously believe about ourselves, that carefully curated narrative we walk around with all day, and what our physical bodies, our nervous systems, actually reveal to the world.
Which makes for incredible drama. And the lecture doesn't waste any time getting into the messy side of it. It starts right in the thick of clinical practice with an anecdote that just hooks you immediately. It's about a dream. And not just a generic dream, a dream reported by a celibate Catholic priest.
A dream that is incredibly dense, with highly specific imagery, which makes it a perfect testing ground for interpretation.
All right, let me paint the picture of this dream because it's incredibly cinematic. The lecturer tells his university class about this priest who dreams he is standing high up on a cliff. He's holding a fishing rod, casting his line down, but the water below him isn't a pristine ocean. It's this incredibly polluted, murky, disgusting water.
He's fishing in filth, essentially.
Exactly. And eventually he gets a bite. He struggles, reels it all the way up the cliff, but instead of catching a fresh fish, he pulls up this grotesque, rotting, decaying fish.
The visual of pulling decay out of pollution is striking enough, but the dream continues to escalate from there.
It gets so much stranger. The priest looks back down into this polluted water, and suddenly he sees women swimming around in it. And they aren't drowning or disgusted. They are completely unbothered by the filth, just swimming happily through the pollution. Then the camera pans, so to speak, and off in the distance of this dirty water, he spots a whale. And finally, the perspective of the dream shifts entirely. He suddenly realizes he isn't just standing safely up on the cliff anymore. His own feet are dipping down, getting wet in this polluted water. He is entering the filth.
It's a phenomenal piece of psychological data. And the pedagogical method the lecturer uses here is highly effective. He throws this dream to a room full of university students and asks them to interpret it. He's essentially daring them to act as armchair analysts.
And the students immediately start applying what we might consider cliché, universal dream symbols. They go straight for the low-hanging fruit.
Well, of course they do.
Someone immediately points to the fishing rod. In a post-Freudian culture, a long, rigid rod held by a celibate man is instantly branded a phallic symbol. The assumption is that because he is denied sexual expression, his unconscious is projecting an overcompensating symbol of masculinity.
Then they move to the environmental context, the polluted water and the decaying fish. The students construct a very logical narrative based on his profession. He's a priest, raised in a rigid, dogmatic environment where matters of the flesh are heavily regulated.
So the dirty water has to mean dirty sex.
Exactly. The dirty water represents carnal sin. The decaying fish he reels in represents the manifestation of intense religious guilt or a broken taboo. He is fishing for something he shouldn't be seeking, and what he acquires is rotten and shameful.
And the class has an absolute field day with the whale in the distance. The interpretations diverge in really interesting ways there. One faction looks at it through a theological lens. They suggest the whale represents the biblical story of Jonah. It's this massive, punishing entity, maybe symbolizing the Catholic Church itself, looming in the distance, ready to swallow him whole.
Which demonstrates how readily we apply cultural or literary frameworks to psychological phenomena. But another student takes a completely different approach, looking at the biological mechanics of the animal. They ask if it's a sperm whale, noting that sperm whales spout water.
Right, so they introduce this massive looming, spouting phallic imagery approaching the women in the water. It just reinforces the whole sexual anxiety narrative.
Yes. And it's a great sequence to listen to because every single one of those guesses sounds incredibly plausible.
Totally. If you wrote an essay analyzing a novel with those interpretations, you'd get top marks.
But this is the exact moment the lecturer pulls the rug out from under the class. He points out that while those interpretations are intellectually clever, they violate the fundamental foundational rule of actual psychoanalysis.
This is such a critical pivot because the objective of clinical psychoanalysis is never for the therapist or a classroom full of eager undergrads to impose their own clever symbolism onto the patient's internal world.
Right. The mind does not operate like a universal translation dictionary where a fish always equals guilt or water always equals emotion.
So if the therapist isn't supposed to interpret the symbols, how on earth do they figure out what the dream means? What is the actual method being used in that room?
The method Freud championed, and the one the lecture emphasizes, is free association. The premise is that the symbolism is violently personal. The therapist's job is not to decode. The therapist's job is to prompt.
You ask the patient to focus on one specific, isolated element.
Exactly. Maybe just the act of holding the fishing rod.
Yeah.
And you instruct them to say absolutely whatever comes to mind, regardless of how trivial, embarrassing, or disconnected it seems.
You're just trying to bypass the conscious filter.
Precisely. The theoretical underpinning of free association is that the human mind is constructed of vast, hidden, idiosyncratic networks. Our memories, our traumas, our desires, they're all tethered together beneath the surface of our awareness. If you pull on one thread, and you manage to keep the patient's conscious defenses from snapping that thread, you will eventually map out how those specific associations are wired in that one specific brain.
And when the lecturer reveals what the free association actually uncovered for this priest, the whole Catholic guilt theory falls apart completely. Through the process of free association, the priest didn't talk about church doctrine. He started talking about his mother.
Yes.
He was an only child, and he revealed this deeply embedded, irrational terror he had carried since childhood. He genuinely believed that his own birth had physically mangled and damaged his mother, and that this physical destruction was the reason she never had any more children.
So the etiology of his anxiety wasn't religious dogmatism at all. On a visceral, pre-logical level, he viewed the act of sex and reproduction as something inherently violent, destructive, and physically catastrophic to women.
Which completely recontextualizes the entire dream. Suddenly, the water isn't polluted because sex is a sin. The water is polluted because sex is physically toxic and damaging. But the most profound part of the reveal involves the women swimming. The lecturer notes that in his waking life, this celibate priest had recently started dating a woman.
He was taking his first tentative steps toward physical intimacy.
Right, which explains why, at the end of the dream, his feet are finally dipping into the water.
But his unconscious mind was in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. Because he unconsciously equated sexuality with physical damage, he literally could not comprehend why his girlfriend would allow him to be intimate with her. To his hidden mind, she was volunteering to be harmed.
He couldn't fathom why these women in his dream, representing his new partner, would willingly, happily swim in this toxic, damaging pollution, completely unbothered.
It is such a staggeringly specific and personal architecture of fear. It had absolutely nothing to do with Jonah or the Pope. It was entirely about his own distorted understanding of female anatomy and his terror of causing pain.
And I think this is a vital moment for you, the listener, to evaluate how you process your own mind. When you wake up from a jarring dream, are you rushing to look up some generic archetype online? Are you assuming that teeth falling out universally means financial stress? Or are you willing to do the uncomfortable work of tracing your own highly unique, deeply personal networks of association?
It demands a level of introspection that most people actively avoid. But while the clinical elegance of free association is undeniable in a narrative sense, it introduces a colossal problem for the field of psychology.
Oh, here we go.
If we accept that the mind is uniquely encoded and only accessible through this highly subjective relational process between a therapist and a patient, how do we prove any of it is real?
Ah, yes. The inevitable backlash from the people in the white lab coats.
Exactly. This brings us to a major paradigm clash discussed in the source material. How do we know the therapist didn't subtly, perhaps unconsciously, guide the priest toward that narrative about his mother? How do we verify that the free association wasn't just a collaborative fiction?
The lecturer doesn't shy away from this at all. He makes it very clear that a massive contingent of academic experimental psychologists, the people running university laboratories, look at psychoanalysis and completely dismiss it. They don't just think it's flawed, they think it's fundamentally unscientific.
Many experimentalists historically viewed Freud as a brilliant but ultimately flaky theorist who spun wild, unfalsifiable narratives based on a microscopic, highly skewed sample size of Victorian patients. And it's crucial to understand that the lab scientists aren't just being curmudgeonly. They're operating on the foundational principles of the scientific method.
Right, they have standards. And the source material outlines 4 primary devastating critiques they level against the clinical approach. I want to dig into those 4 critiques because they really form the bedrock of what separates a hard science from a soft science or even a philosophy. What's the first major issue the experimentalists raise?
The first, and arguably most fatal critique, is the lack of replicability. The gold standard of empirical science is that an experiment must be reproducible. If a researcher in Tokyo discovers a chemical reaction, a researcher in London must be able to follow the exact same methodology and achieve the exact same result. Psychoanalysis inherently defies this.
Because you're dealing with a dynamic human life, not a static chemical in a beaker.
Precisely. You cannot take a patient who has undergone traditional psychoanalysis, lying on a couch 4 days a week for 6 years, hit a master reset button, wipe their memory, and then run them through a 6-year course of cognitive behavioral therapy to compare the outcomes. The intervention itself irrevocably alters the subject.
The data is fundamentally unreplicable by design. You can't run a control group on someone's childhood trauma. That makes perfect sense. And that leads directly into the second critique, which is about the human element on the other side of the couch subjective bias.
Confirmation bias is a formidable force. The experimentalists argue that therapists, despite their rigorous training, are ultimately human beings subject to heuristic errors. The lecturer offers a highly illustrative example of this.
The eating disorder example, right?
Yes. Imagine a clinician who has spent years specializing in eating disorders. They treat 10 patients with anorexia in a row, and through their sessions, they conclude that all 10 patients suffer from deep-seated, unconscious issues regarding control. They are using food restriction as the sole mechanism to exert mastery over a chaotic internal world.
Which might be entirely true for those 10 patients. But the problem arises when patient number 11 walks into the office.
Exactly. When that 11th patient arrives presenting with anorexia, the therapist is already wearing a highly specific theoretical lens. They are unconsciously primed to listen for statements that validate their existing theory of control.
And they filter out the rest.
Right. They are highly likely to ignore or downplay any associative data that points to a completely different etiology, perhaps a trauma completely unrelated to control. The observer actively constructs the reality they expect to find.
And because of the nature of the therapy, no one else can check their work, which is the third critique private data. I mean, if I publish a physics paper, I have to publish my raw data sets so my peers can tear them apart and look for errors. But that doesn't happen in a psychoanalytic institute.
It cannot happen. The data generated in psychoanalysis is born out of intense intimacy and absolute confidentiality. It exists solely in the dynamic space between 2 individuals behind a soundproof door. From an experimentalist's perspective, data that cannot be publicly audited is not scientific data. It is an anecdote.
Just trust me, you had to be there. Is a really tough sell at a science conference.
It is an impossible sell.
Oh.
And this culminates in the fourth critique, which addresses the chaotic fragmentation of the clinical field and the circular logic used to defend it. As the lecturer notes, there aren't just 1 or 2 schools of psychotherapy. There are over 400 distinct, often wildly contradictory schools of thought.
Jungians, Adlerians, Gestalt therapists.
Exactly, object relations theorists, and they all claim that their specific private clinical anecdotes definitively prove their unique worldview.
So when the experimental psychologists look at this mess of 400 different theories and say, okay, show us the objective proof, how do the clinicians usually respond?
The historical defense has often relied on an appeal to specialized authority. The analysts argue that the experimentalists simply lack the highly specialized experiential training required to perceive the data.
Wait, so they're saying you just don't get it because you haven't been trained to see it?
Essentially, yes. They argue that if the lab scientists underwent years of personal analysis and clinical supervision, they too would clearly see the undeniable truth of the unconscious mechanisms at play.
I can see why the lab scientists would absolutely hate that answer. It's a completely closed loop. The lab scientists are essentially saying, you're telling me that the only way I can see your evidence is if I spend 5 years being systematically indoctrinated into your specific belief system. By the time I finish the training, of course I'll see what you see because I'll be completely biased.
It represents a fundamental epistemological deadlock. The two sides cannot even agree on what constitutes valid evidence. For the experimentalist, evidence must be controlled, quantified, and publicly replicable. For the clinician, a patient like our priest having a sudden, raw, visceral realization about his mother's fertility after months of resistance is profoundly valid observational data.
Regardless of whether it can be reproduced in a laboratory spreadsheet. Now, what I love about this source material is that the lecturer doesn't just present the lab scientist's side and leave the clinicians defenseless. He provides these incredibly sharp, almost combative analogies to explain exactly why the psychoanalysts believe the experimentalists are missing the point entirely.
The analogies serve to highlight the absurdity of applying reductionist laboratory constraints to the immense complexity of the human psyche.
Let's walk through the first one, the GP and the prostate. The lecturer asks us to imagine a scenario where a middle-aged man goes to his general practitioner and says, "Doc, I'm having some serious prostate trouble." The doctor nods, tells the patient to open his mouth wide, shines a little flashlight down the patient's throat, looks around for a few seconds, and then confidently declares, "Well, I see absolutely no evidence of prostate enlargement. You're perfectly fine."
The methodology is rigorous in its execution, but entirely misapplied in its focus.
Right. And the psychoanalysts are looking at the academic researchers and saying, this is exactly what you are doing to psychology. You take a privileged, baseline, healthy, 19-year-old college sophomore. You bring them into a sterile, artificially lit laboratory for exactly 30 minutes.
And you ask them to fill out a multiple-choice questionnaire about their feelings.
Or you have them press the space bar when they see a word on a screen. And based on that, you publish a paper boldly declaring, we found absolutely no empirical evidence of deep unconscious emotional conflict or repressed childhood trauma.
The clinical argument is that a 30-minute keyboard task is structurally incapable of capturing the architecture of repression. A trauma that has been heavily defended against for 30 years is not going to reveal itself on a bubble sheet to a stranger in a lab coat. The clinicians argue that the depth of the psyche demands a duration of observation and a depth of therapeutic relationship that laboratory settings are inherently designed to prevent.
It's a really compelling counter-argument. You can't measure the depth of the ocean with a foot-long ruler. But the lecturer also addresses that sticky issue of training, and the lab scientists complain that the clinicians are just using circular logic to protect their theories. He uses the analogy of the radiologist and the limp.
This analogy specifically defends the concept of specialized perception, arguing that it is not inherently unscientific to require training to observe a phenomenon.
Right. Imagine you've developed a terrible, agonizing limp. You finally go to a radiologist. They take an X-ray of your leg, put it up on the light box, point to a tiny blurry gray smudge surrounded by other blurry gray smudges, and say, there's the problem. You have a hairline fracture right there. Now you, the untrained patient, look at that film and see absolutely nothing but static. You say, "Doc, I can't read this picture. I don't see a fracture. What other proof do you have?"
And the doctor says, well, you're limping in agony.
And you argue back, "But I could be limping for 100 different reasons. It could be a pulled muscle, a torn tendon, or just a psychological ticket."
The central premise here is that the inability of a layperson or an experimental psychologist without thousands of hours of clinical experience to read the subtle dynamic defense mechanisms in a patient's behavior does not negate the existence of those mechanisms. Just as it takes years to learn the complex rules of inference required to properly interpret an X-ray, it takes years of supervised clinical experience to learn how to identify projection, displacement, or reaction formation in real-time dialogue.
And the lecturer gets wonderfully snide here, which I deeply appreciate. He brings up what we can call the tone-deaf professor argument. He points out that some psychological defenses are actually so obvious that even children grasp them intuitively. If you take a 10-year-old child and you explain a scenario, say, hey, Johnny's sister tragically died yesterday, but Johnny is walking around school today smiling, insisting she's perfectly fine, and telling everyone he just had breakfast with her.
If you ask a 10-year-old why Johnny is doing that, the child won't be confused.
Exactly. The child will instantly say, Johnny is just saying that because it hurts too much to know his sister is dead.
The child possesses an intuitive, empathetic understanding of the psychological defense mechanism known as profound denial. They understand that the mind can reject reality to protect the organism from unbearable emotional pain.
But then you have these 50-year-old, highly educated, tenured psychology professors who stand up at conferences and demand double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled laboratory proof that unconscious defense mechanisms actually exist. The lecturer essentially argues that if a professor demands laboratory proof for a phenomenon that a 10-year-old can perceive intuitively, perhaps that professor is simply psychologically tone-deaf.
And it is absurd to demand that an entire clinical field jump through artificial experimental hoops just to prove that a melody exists to a subset of academics who lack the capacity to hear the music.
It is a blistering critique of extreme scientific reductionism, and it perfectly encapsulates the animosity of that era.
However, the true brilliance of the source material is how it navigates out of this stalemate, because the paradigm did not remain fractured forever. Over the last few decades, a new generation of experimental scientists did not just complain about the clinicians, they actually built better tools.
They found ingenious, rigorous, replicable ways to capture the invisible. They brought the unconscious mind into the laboratory.
Yes, they stopped looking down the throat for the prostate and actually built the psychological MRI machine. And they started by tackling a foundational Freudian concept, but approaching it strictly through cognitive mechanics. They set out to prove unconscious thought.
We touched on this concept briefly when discussing free association, the idea of spreading activation. This is the theory that human memory and thought are not stored in isolated filing cabinets, but are wired together in vast, incredibly complex, hidden associative networks.
Like a massive spider web. If you pluck one tiny string on the edge of the web, the vibration travels silently along the connected threads, activating other areas of the web without you consciously directing it.
And the lecturer doesn't just describe this theory. He demonstrates it live, in real time, to his lecture hall full of students. It's a beautifully simple demonstration known generally as a priming or spelling test.
It's a very clever bit of showmanship.
He divides the massive lecture hall right down the middle. He tells the right side of the room to close their eyes, cover their ears, and silently count to 30. They are the control group. They are completely distracted and isolated. But he gives the left side of the room a very specific cognitive task. He asks them to memorize a short list of paired words.
The pairs are incredibly mundane. Taxi cab, lighthouse, paper pencil.
The mundane nature of the words is intentional, right?
Exactly. He is activating very specific, ordinary nodes within their associative networks without triggering any emotional defenses.
Once they've memorized the pairs, he brings the whole room back together. Now, to ensure that the left side of the room isn't just actively, consciously repeating taxi cab in their heads, he introduces a distractor task. He has the entire room count backward from 100 to 90 out loud together. He is deliberately fleshing their conscious working memory.
Finally, once the conscious slate is wiped clean, he asks everyone in the room to write down the spelling of the word fair, just the sound of the word.
Which is an auditory prompt that demands a structural choice. In the English language, there are two primary common ways to spell that phonetic sound. You have F-A-I-R, which denotes a carnival, an exhibition, or the concept of equity and justice. And you have F-A-R-E, which refers to the fee you pay for transportation, like a bus or a cab.
Now, linguistically, F-A-I-R is simply the more common usage in everyday life. If you ask a random sampling of the population to spell the word, the overwhelming majority will default to F-A-I-R.
And indeed, the right side of the room, the distracted control group, spells it exactly that way. But the left side of the room behaves completely differently. A statistically massive portion of the group that memorized the word pairs spells the word F-A-R-E.
And the mechanism driving that behavioral change is spreading activation. When those students consciously memorized the word taxi, they activated a specific semantic node in their brain. Even after the distraction task cleared their conscious awareness, that initial activation continued to spread outward, silently traveling down the associative pathways and illuminating related concepts in the dark basement of their cognition.
It silently lit up the concept of a taxi fare.
Precisely. So, when the auditory prompt was finally given, Their unconscious network simply handed the spelling F-A-R-E up to the conscious mind, which accepted it without question.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The spelling test proves that a conscious thought can have an unconscious ripple effect. But the hardcore cognitive scientists wanted to push the boundary much further. They wanted to prove that this complex cognitive processing, this spreading activation, could happen even if the subject never consciously registered the priming word in the first place.
They wanted to completely sever the process from conscious awareness. And to achieve this, they utilized a famously grueling experimental setup called the dichotic listening procedure.
Dichotic listening is a cornerstone methodology in the study of attention and perception. The physical setup is designed to absolutely overwhelm the brain's conscious bandwidth. The subject is seated in a soundproof booth wearing high-fidelity headphones. The researcher plays two completely independent, continuous streams of audio into the subject's ears simultaneously.
Into the right ear, perhaps a narrator is reading a dense chapter from an economics textbook. Into the left ear, a different voice is reading a random, disconnected list of vocabulary words.
Just listening to two things at once is hard enough, but the researchers force the issue. They require the subject to perform a task called shadowing.
Yes, shadowing requires the subject to focus 100% of their cognitive effort on the right ear. As the narrator reads the economics textbook, the subject must repeat every single word out loud, in real time, matching the pace of the audio.
It is an incredibly demanding cognitive task that monopolizes working memory and executive function. The subject must actively, desperately suppress and ignore the audio stream entering their left ear just to keep up with the shadowing task.
And it works perfectly.
Yeah.
If the researcher suddenly stops the tape and asks the exhausted subject, "Hey, what was playing in your left ear just now? Did you hear the word taxi?" The subject will honestly, truthfully swear they heard absolutely nothing but a vague hum or static.
Their conscious awareness was so entirely occupied by the shadowing task that the left ear's audio never breached the threshold of consciousness. If you force them to guess what words were played, they perform no better than random chance.
From a subjective, experiential standpoint, the left ear's data simply does not exist to them.
But the data does exist to their unconscious. If the researchers sneak the word taxi into that completely ignored, actively suppressed left ear stream, and immediately afterward asks the subject to spell the word fare, the subject still systematically spells it F-A-R-E.
Which is the monumental finding in the history of cognitive science. It proves definitively that the brain is not merely a passive receiver waiting for conscious direction. The subject's auditory cortex received the acoustic signal of the word taxi. The language centers processed the semantic meaning of the word. The associative networks triggered the spreading activation to the concept of a fare, and the motor cortex executed a changed behavioral output.
All of this highly complex, multi-stage cognitive processing occurred entirely in the dark. The basement machinery did all the work, and the conscious mind, the supposed CEO of the brain, was merely handed the final memo, completely oblivious to how the decision was made.
It's a little terrifying when you apply it to real life.
Yeah.
For you listening right now, consider the sheer volume of data bombarding your sensory organs at every moment.
Think about your commute this morning. The dozens of billboards you drove past while your conscious mind was focused on the bumper of the car ahead of you. The snippet of a heated argument you overheard at the coffee shop while you were anxiously composing an email on your phone. The specific tempo of the background music playing in the grocery store aisle.
Your conscious mind filtered all of that out as noise. But your unconscious brain absorbed every single piece of it, processed the semantic and emotional meaning, and fed those variables into the associative networks that are subtly, invisibly nudging the decisions you make, the moods you feel, and the words you choose throughout your day.
It fundamentally challenges our cherished notions of autonomy and free will. We are constantly being primed by an environment we aren't even aware we are perceiving.
However, as the lecturer points out, cognitive priming, altering how someone spells a word, is a relatively cold, clinical, intellectual process.
Right.
The researchers knew that to truly validate the Freudian concept of the unconscious, they had to tackle a much more difficult, inherently paradoxical question. They had to ask, can a human being experience an emotion without knowing they are feeling it? Can emotion itself be unconscious?
Which, on its face, sounds like a total oxymoron. The very definition of a feeling is that you feel it, right? If you aren't feeling it, it's not a feeling.
But the lecture walks us through 4 distinct, escalating experiments that prove unconscious emotion is an absolute measurable reality. And the first one relies on a piece of classic laboratory equipment called a tachistoscope, or a T-scope.
A tachistoscope is fundamentally a highly calibrated slide projector. It is designed to flash images or words onto a screen for precisely controlled fractions of a second durations, so brief that they fall below the threshold of conscious visual perception.
We're talking about a burst of light so fast that your conscious brain can't even assemble the letters. You're sitting in the dark, staring at a screen, and a flash occurs. If the researcher asks what you saw, you'd likely say, just a blur.
But the researchers noticed a highly peculiar pattern in the data when they varied the type of words being flashed. When they flashed emotionally neutral, mundane words like chair, blue, or apple subjects would occasionally catch enough visual data to guess correctly. They'd say, oh, I think I saw apple.
But the experimental parameters shifted dramatically when the researchers introduced taboo words into the sequence. These were words that were highly socially unacceptable in that era, heavily vulgar, or deeply emotionally charged.
When the taboo words were flashed at the exact same subperceptual speed as the neutral words, the subjects suddenly developed a profound visual deficit. Their recognition rates plummeted. They became functionally blind to the taboo words, failing to recognize them at significantly higher rates than the mundane words.
And to address the obvious skeptical rebuttal, the researchers rigorously controlled for social desirability bias. They designed the experiment so the subjects didn't have to speak the vulgar words out loud to a researcher. They recorded their answers in absolute, anonymous privacy. Even with the embarrassment factor removed, the perceptual blindness persisted.
The implications of this are staggering regarding how the brain filters reality. What this data proves is that the visual cortex receives the light data and transmits it to the brain. Before the conscious mind is allowed to see the word, an unconscious emotional surveillance system, likely involving the amygdala, intercepts the data.
It reads it, comprehensively evaluates its social and emotional valence, determines that the content is too threatening or taboo for the conscious mind to handle, and actively sends an inhibitory signal to block the word from entering conscious awareness.
Your brain reads the dirty word, gasps, and covers your conscious mind's eyes before you even know what happened. It is the exact literal mechanism of Freudian repression, captured and quantified in a laboratory setting. The emotional filter reacts to the threat before the conscious realization can occur.
It is a remarkably elegant proof. But the second experiment, which we might refer to as the shocking dog paradigm, moves beyond visual filtering and provides visceral, undeniable physiological proof of unconscious terror.
This experiment is intense and honestly probably wouldn't get past an ethics board today. They bring a subject into the lab and immediately hook them up to a polygraph-style machine designed to measure galvanic skin response, or GSR.
GSR is a highly sensitive metric. It tracks microscopic changes in the electrical conductivity of the skin, which is directly linked to sweat gland activity and autonomic nervous system arousal. It is a direct, unforgeable biological proxy for stress, anxiety, and fear.
Once hooked up to the monitor, the researchers begin a process of raw classical conditioning. They read a list of words. Every time the researcher says the mundane word dog, they immediately deliver a mild but highly unpleasant electric shock to the subject.
The conditioning takes hold very rapidly. Within a few trials, the subject's central nervous system learns the association. The auditory stimulus of the word dog becomes inextricably linked with the anticipation of physical pain. The body learns to fear the word itself.
You can see it on the monitor. Just saying dog causes their GSR to spike wildly even before the shock is delivered. So the phobia is installed. Now, the researchers transition the terrified subject back into the dichotic listening setup. The subject puts on the headphones. They are instructed to shadow the complex audio in their right ear, repeating it out loud, demanding 100% of their conscious focus. They are actively ignoring the audio stream in their left ear.
The subject's conscious bandwidth is entirely saturated by the shadowing task. They have no conscious awareness of the data entering the left ear.
And then the researchers quietly slip the word dog into the ignored left ear stream.
If you pause the experiment at that precise millisecond and interrogate the subject's conscious mind, they will report nothing. They did not hear the word. They're focused on the shadowing.
But the GSR monitor tells a violently different story. The exact millisecond the word dog plays in that ignored ear, the subject's sweat glands flood. Their heart rate accelerates. Their skin conductivity spikes off the charts. Their physical body is experiencing a massive, full-blown physiological panic attack in response to the phobic trigger.
Yet if the researcher stops the tape right then and asks the subject, hey, how are you feeling right now? Are you experiencing any anxiety? The subject will look completely confused and consciously report, "No, I'm perfectly fine, just a little tired from the shadowing task." Zero conscious anxiety.
It is a profound dissociation. Their autonomic nervous system is screaming in terror, reacting to a verified threat, but the conscious, subjective awareness of that terror is completely severed. They are living the physical reality of profound fear, but the emotional experience is entirely unconscious.
It's wild to think your body can be having a panic attack that your mind doesn't know about. But the third experiment the lecturer discusses shifts the focus away from negative emotions like fear and asks if we can unconsciously generate positive emotions like preference or love. It revolves around a psychological concept called the mere exposure effect, famously researched by Zojunk and Wilson.
And I think the easiest way to grasp this concept without getting bogged down in the lab details is to think about the mechanics of COP40 radio.
It is a ubiquitous cultural phenomenon that perfectly illustrates the underlying cognitive mechanism.
We've all experienced it. A highly produced, repetitive pop song is released. The very first time you hear it on the radio, you actively dislike it. You think it's grating, simplistic, absolutely putrid. But the radio station's programming dictates that the song is played on a relentless loop every hour, on the hour, for weeks.
Eventually, you stop actively listening to it. It just becomes ambient background noise while you commute or shop.
But 3 weeks later, you find yourself happily tapping your steering wheel to the beat, humming the chorus in the shower, and suddenly, you genuinely, authentically like the song. The sheer repeated exposure to the stimulus without any conscious evaluation literally manufactured a positive emotional preference.
Zajanc and Wilson understood this mechanism, but they wanted to isolate it entirely from conscious memory. They wanted to see if they could manufacture liking something that the subject didn't even know existed. They returned to the dichotic listening paradigm.
The ultimate tool for cognitive isolation. The subject is shadowing the right ear, completely ignoring the left ear. But this time, instead of spoken words, the researchers play complex, unfamiliar sequences of musical tones into the ignored left ear. They structure it so that certain specific tone sequences are played repeatedly, dozens of times, while other sequences are only played once or twice.
Once the dichotic listening phase is concluded, the testing phase begins. The researchers play the various tone sequences openly, in the room, and ask the subjects a direct memory question. Have you ever heard this specific sequence of tones before?
And the subjects fail the memory test completely. Because their conscious attention was locked on the shadowing task, they never encoded the tones into explicit memory. They are guessing completely at random. They cannot consciously recognize any of the music.
But the researchers then pivot and ask an emotional question. They play the sequences again and ask, regardless of whether you remember them, which of these tone sequences do you simply like the best? Which one feels most pleasant to you?
And the data is undeniable. Consistently across the board, the subjects demonstrate a strong, statistically significant preference for the tone sequences that were played repeatedly in their ignored ear. Their auditory system processed the tones, logged the frequency of the exposure, and the brain's emotional centers generated a genuine subjective feeling of liking or preference for those specific patterns, all without a single drop of conscious memory or awareness of the exposure. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it fundamentally destabilizes how we view our own identities. We tend to believe that our likes, our dislikes, our aesthetic tastes, and our intuitive preferences are the core defining features of our unique personalities, arrived at through conscious refinement. What this data implies is that a massive portion of our personality may be constructed entirely in the dark, assembled by an unconscious brain quietly tallying environmental exposures that we never even knew we experienced.
Which is a humbling thought. But the final piece of evidence the lecturer provides in this section is perhaps the most heartbreaking, while also being the most scientifically unassailable proof that our emotional brains operate independently of our conscious narrative. It is the famously tragic medical case of patient HM. Patient HM, whose real name was Henry Molaison, is arguably the single most important individual subject in the entire history of neuroscience. In the 1950s, he suffered from incredibly severe, intractable epilepsy that threatened his life. In a desperate attempt to cure him, neurosurgeons performed an experimental procedure, removing bilateral portions of his medial temporal lobe, which crucially included the removal of his hippocampus.
What the medical community did not fully understand at the time was that the hippocampus is the essential biological engine required for encoding new, declarative, long-term memories.
So the surgery cured his seizures, but the side effect was catastrophic. Patient HM was left permanently, irrevocably trapped in the present tense. His working memory was fine. He could hold a normal conversation with you for 5 minutes, but if you walked out of the room, waited 10 minutes, and walked back in, he would have absolute zero recollection of ever having met you. Every single day, every single moment was a wiped slate.
The profound tragedy of HM's daily existence provided researchers with a unique, albeit entirely unintended, window into the structural architecture of human memory. Dr. Brenda Milner, the pioneering neuropsychologist who studied him intensely for decades, had to formally introduce herself to him every single day they worked together.
And the lecturer shares a specific, incredibly poignant anecdote from HM's life that illuminates the divide between thought and feeling. At one point during the years he was being studied, HM's father passed away. When the medical staff brought HM the news of his father's death, his reaction was entirely appropriate and devastating. He wept openly. He experienced the profound, acute, crushing grief of losing a parent.
But because his hippocampus was gone, the cognitive reality of that event could not be saved to his hard drive.
Once the immediate moment passed, and his conscious attention was distracted by a meal or a task, the explicit, declarative memory of the conversation was entirely erased. If a researcher approached him 30 minutes later and casually asked, "Hey, Henry, how's your father doing?" HM would genuinely respond, "Oh, I guess he's doing fine." He had entirely lost the factual data of the death.
But here is the critical distinction. The data was gone, but the emotion didn't evaporate. While HM couldn't tell you what happened, his emotional state was fundamentally altered. He would frequently report to the staff that he was suffering from a vague, uneasy feeling. He would describe a heavy, unshakable sorrow or anxiety, but he was completely incapable of articulating why he felt that way. The cognitive narrative, the what happened, was deleted, but the emotional memory, that how it felt, survived the memory wipe.
And we now understand the neuroanatomy behind this phenomenon. The surgical excision removed his hippocampus, destroying his cognitive memory system. But the emotional processing centers of the brain, specifically the amygdala and other structures within the limbic system that deal with pure physiological feeling, were left largely intact. HM's case proves that the cognitive memory and the emotional memory are not the same thing. They are processed, encoded, and stored in entirely different, parallel neurological systems. The emotional brain processes and retains trauma entirely independently of our conscious, logical narrative.
Which is a perfect pivot point for the lecture, because if we accept that our emotional brain operates in the dark, retaining traumas and fears that our conscious mind has deleted or denied, it begs a massive, unsettling question. How often is our physical body actively betraying the lies our conscious mind insists on telling? This brings us to a fascinating study by psychologist Jonathan Shedler and his concept of illusory mental health.
Shedler's work represents a direct, highly sophisticated challenge to the foundational methodology of modern psychological research. For decades, the vast majority of psychological data was gathered using a very simple tool, the self-report questionnaire. If researchers wanted to ascertain a population's anxiety levels, they handed out a piece of paper with a Likert scale and essentially asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious are you?
It assumes that the subject is both completely honest and completely self-aware, and Shedler looked at that assumption and called it fundamentally flawed. He argued that the researchers were completely ignoring the reality of defensive bias.
His premise was simple. If you hand 100 people a checklist of severe neurotic symptoms and ask them if they are unstable, a large percentage will naturally check the box that says, "I am perfectly fine." Now, Shedler conceded that maybe 70% of those people who claim to be fine are actually telling the truth. They are genuinely healthy.
But he hypothesized that a significant chunk of that remaining 30% are engaged in massive defensive denial. They aren't just lying to the researcher to look good. They are lying to themselves. Their conscious mind literally cannot tolerate the reality that they are struggling.
Shedler termed this phenomenon illusory mental health. These are individuals who consciously, genuinely believe they are paradigms of psychological stability, but whose unconscious architecture is deeply troubled and fraught with conflict. The monumental challenge Shedler faced was methodological. How do you experimentally, objectively prove that someone is secretly, unconsciously stressed when they will pass every polygraph swearing that they are perfectly fine?
Shedler's experimental design is a masterpiece of psychological triangulation. He didn't just use one metric, he pitted two completely different paradigms against each other. Phase 1 was standard protocol. He brought in a large cohort of subjects and had them complete comprehensive gold standard self-report questionnaires measuring neuroticism, anxiety, and overall mental health.
He established their conscious baseline. What do they claim their mental state is?
Exactly. Then, for phase two, he completely abandoned the questionnaires and deployed a classic old-school psychoanalytic tool. He asked every single subject to write down short narratives describing their 8 to 10 earliest childhood memories. Just simple, open-ended prompts like, describe your earliest memory of an interaction with your mother, or describe an early memory involving your father.
The psychoanalytic theory here is that early memories, whether factually accurate or slightly distorted by time, act as projective tests. The way an individual constructs and recalls their foundational early relationships reveals the deep, unconscious blueprint of their current psychological functioning.
Shedler then took this massive stack of childhood memories and handed them over to an expert psychoanalyst named Marty May. Now, this is the crucial part. Marty May was entirely blind to the results of the self-report questionnaires. He had no idea who claimed to be anxious and who claimed to be fine. His singular task was to read these early memories and score them psychoanalytically.
He was looking for deep structural clues. Was the emotional tone of the memory warm and secure, or was it colored by subtle hostility, neglect, or profound anxiety? Based purely on those memories, Marty May categorized each subject as either relatively healthy or relatively sick on a deep structural level.
So Shedler now possessed two independent data sets, the subject's conscious self-assessment and the analyst's unconscious structural assessment. When he cross-referenced the data, distinct groups emerged. There was a transparently healthy group, the subjects claimed they were fine, and the analysts reading their memories agreed. There was the transparently troubled group. The subjects admitted on the questionnaire that they were highly anxious, and the analyst's reading of their memories confirmed it.
But the entire focus of the study was on the discrepancy group, the group Shedler labeled as having illusory mental health. These are the specific subjects who confidently, emphatically checked all the boxes on the questionnaire, claiming, I have absolutely zero anxiety, I am a picture of robust mental health, but whose early childhood memories revealed profound psychological conflict, trauma, and insecurity to the blind analyst.
Shedler had identified his target demographic, but he still needed objective proof to determine which assessment was accurate, the conscious claim or the unconscious diagnosis. To resolve the deadlock, Shedler placed all the subjects across all groups into a pressurized laboratory environment designed to induce mild acute psychological stress.
He hooked them all up to a battery of continuous medical monitoring equipment, tracking heart rate, blood pressure, the works. And then he made them perform incredibly frustrating tasks. He forced them to solve complex mental math problems out loud against a ticking clock, and he made them invent creative stories on the spot while being judged. He wanted to see if the immense hidden cognitive effort of constantly defending against their own unconscious anxiety was taking a measurable physical toll under pressure.
The physiological data that emerged from this stress test was nothing short of stunning. The discrepancy group, the individuals who vehemently claimed they were the healthiest, least anxious people in the study, exhibited biological profiles that entirely betrayed their conscious narrative.
Their bodies completely sold them out. Under the stress of the mental math and storytelling tasks, the illusory mental health group's physiological reactivity was completely off the charts. They experienced the most violent, sustained spikes in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Their heart rates accelerated far beyond the transparently anxious group. Biologically, they were in a state of sheer panic.
And the betrayal was not limited to internal cardiovascular metrics. It manifested in their observable behavior. Shedler had independent blind coders listen to the audio recordings of the subjects performing the tasks. The coders noted that the discrepancy group exhibited the highest frequencies of behavioral anxiety markers. They suffered from severe verbal blocking. They stammered, they stuttered, they lost their train of thought, they took long, agonizing, awkward pauses, and they exhibited heavy, forced sighing. Their entire physical and vocal presentation was screaming of extreme distress.
Which makes the final data point of the experiment so darkly comedic. Right in the middle of this physiological meltdown, while their blood pressure is spiking and they are stuttering through a story, Shedler stops the test and hands them a quick questionnaire asking, right now, in this moment, how anxious are you feeling? And that specific group, the ones whose bodies are essentially having a heart attack, consciously report feeling the least amount of subjective anxiety of anyone in the entire laboratory.
It is the ultimate, empirically validated proof of the Freudian concept of denial. It proves that an individual can be experiencing profound, systemic, destructive stress. Their cardiovascular system can be working overtime, their body actively breaking down under the strain, and yet their conscious mind will stubbornly, seamlessly insist everything is perfectly fine. The physical body keeps a meticulous ledger of the psychological reality, even when the conscious mind absolutely refuses to look at the scoreboard.
And what's really terrifying is that this massive disconnect between our conscious beliefs and our unconscious reality isn't just limited to hiding anxiety in a lab test. The lecturer smoothly transitions to show how this exact same blindness heavily dictates our long-term goals and what actually drives our behavior over the course of an entire lifetime. This moves us away from clinical defense mechanisms and right into the rigorous study of human motivation, spearheaded by the psychologist David McClelland.
McClelland's research fundamentally disrupts how we conceptualize ambition and career trajectory. Historically, if an organizational psychologist wanted to know what motivated an employee, they utilized the exact same flawed methodology Shedler criticized. They just asked them. They handed the subject a survey asking, do you value high achievement? Do you desire to be a powerful, influential leader? Or is your primary goal to build intimate, collaborative relationships? These self-reported desires are classified as explicit motives.
And McClellan realized that explicit motives are just the PR firm of the brain talking. They tell you what the person thinks they should want or what society tells them is appropriate to want. To bypass the PR firm and find the actual engine driving the person, McClellan utilized an alternative, projected methodology heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory. He used a variation of the thematic apperception test, or TAT.
The mechanics of this test are crucial. Instead of asking a direct question, the researcher presents the subject with a series of deliberately ambiguous, vaguely drawn pictures. For example, one image might simply show two people standing near a desk in an office, their expressions unclear. The subject is instructed to use their imagination to invent a complete story about the picture. Who are these people? What led up to this moment? What are they feeling, and how will the story end?
The genius of the TAT is that because the picture provides no real details, the subject has to pull the narrative structure from their own internal blueprint. The stories they invent act as a mirror for their unconscious drives. Researchers then rigorously code these stories for underlying themes. Does the subject repeatedly invent stories about one person trying to dominate or influence the other? That indicates a high implicit need for power. Do they invent stories about the characters striving to solve a complex problem or win a prize? That indicates an implicit need for achievement. Do the stories constantly revolve around the characters trying to repair a broken friendship or share a vulnerable moment? That reveals an implicit need for intimacy. These are the implicit motives.
And when McClellan compared the subject's conscious, explicit questionnaire answers with the deep, implicit motives revealed by their storytelling, the findings were a massive wake-up call to the field of psychology. First and foremost, he found absolutely zero statistical correlation between what people consciously claimed they wanted on a survey and what their implicit fantasy stories revealed they actually hungered for on a gut level. The two systems were entirely unaligned.
But the real kicker is the predictive power of these two different systems. If you want to predict what someone will do in the next 5 minutes in a highly structured environment, the explicit conscious motive is actually quite useful. If someone explicitly checks a box saying, I highly value achievement, and you sit them down at a desk and say, I need you to try really hard on this math puzzle right now, they will likely exert effort. The conscious mind can manage short-term, clearly defined tasks.
However, human lives are not short-term, clearly defined tasks. We navigate decades of ambiguous, unstructured reality. And McClellan discovered through massive longitudinal studies that if you want to predict the trajectory of a human life over 10, 20, or 30 years, the conscious questionnaires are worse than useless. They are misleading. It was the implicit motives, the deep, unconscious drives revealed solely by the projective storytelling that accurately, consistently predicted long-term, real-world behavioral outcomes.
The data on this is wild. McClellan tracked cohorts of people for decades. He found that individuals who exhibited a high implicit need for power in those projective stories during their 20s were overwhelmingly more likely to rise to high-level, highly successful managerial and executive positions 30 years later. And here is the crazy part. Their conscious, explicitly stated desire for power on the questionnaires back in their 20s had absolutely no statistical relationship to their eventual career success.
It powerfully suggests that our conscious goals, our carefully crafted 5-year plans, are often just superficial dressing. The engine actually providing the torque, the fuel propelling the organism through decades of resistance and effort, is the implicit motive operating entirely outside of awareness.
And the lecturer provides a brilliant, highly relatable, and frankly, kind of tragic analogy for how this disconnect plays out in daily life, focusing on what he dubs the 1990s liberal couple.
It is a masterful illustration of how implicit programming sabotages conscious ideology. So visualize this specific cultural archetype. It's the 1990s. You have a modern, highly educated, dual-income couple. Let's focus on the husband. Consciously, cognitively, this man is deeply, sincerely committed to egalitarian feminist values. If you give him a sociological questionnaire, he will passionately and strongly agree that household chores, childcare, and mental load should be split exactly 50-50. It is not an act. It is his genuinely held conscious ideology.
But an ideology is a fragile neocortical construct. The critical question McClellan's framework forces us to ask is, what are this man's implicit motives? How is his deep, nonverbal, emotional brain wired regarding gender roles and domestic labor during the foundational years of his development?
The lecture points out the demographic reality. This man, an adult in the 1990s, was likely born and raised in a household in the 1950s or early 1960s. He grew up in an era characterized by a strict, highly traditional sexual division of labor. As a toddler, sitting on the kitchen floor, long before he had the vocabulary to debate gender politics, his developing emotional brain was intensely observing and internalizing the dynamics of his parents. His brain recorded very specific, implicit blueprints about what it means to be a man, what a home looks like, and who is responsible for the laundry.
The resulting psychological architecture is a state of permanent internal conflict. The conscious, rational mind of the 1990s believes fervently in absolute equality, but the unconscious, implicit emotional brain of the 1950s defaults to an entirely different standard of behavior.
And the result of this conflict is that the conscious mind almost always loses the war of attrition, unless this husband's conscious attention is actively, forcefully drawn to the discrepancy, unless his partner is standing right there saying, hey, you are currently not doing your share of the work. His routine operating procedure will inevitably default back to his implicit programming. When he is tired, when he is distracted, when he goes on autopilot, he will unconsciously do less around the house. He will walk past the full laundry basket without genuinely seeing it as his responsibility, despite his fiercely held conscious beliefs to the contrary. The deeply ingrained gut-level motive will always override the cognitive ideal whenever executive function wavers.
It is a profound demonstration of why structural behavioral change is so incredibly difficult. You are not just changing your mind. You are fighting decades of implicit neurological wiring. And the source material highlights a staggering statistical correlation regarding exactly how early these implicit motives are locked into our hardware.
This is the single wildest statistic in the entire hour of the lecture, and it forces you to rethink everything about parenting. The longitudinal data shows that the severity of a child's toilet training at age 2, literally age 2, is a massive, highly significant predictor of that person's implicit need for power at age 30. How strict the parents were, how punitive the environment was, how much agonizing control the toddler had to exert over their own bodily functions to appease giant, powerful adults. That preverbal struggle permanently wires their unconscious drive for dominance, control, or power decades later in the boardroom. And yet, I cannot stress this enough, that traumatic age 2 toilet training has absolutely zero statistical correlation with what that 30-year-old executive will consciously claim they want out of life.
It is a profound, almost disturbing illustration of classic psychoanalytic developmental theory supported by rigorous, modern longitudinal data. The intensely emotional experiences we endure before we even possess the language to describe them shape the foundational, unalterable drives of our adult lives, which brings the lecture inevitably full circle. We return to the original architect of drive theory himself. We are forced to look at the dark side of motivation and Freud's fundamental conception of the human animal.
Right. If we accept that implicit motives drive the car, we have to ask what kind of raw fuel is in the tank. Freud called this fuel psychic energy. He held a profoundly cynical, or perhaps just brutally honest view of humanity. He believed that underneath all our polite civilization, our manners, our art, and our technology, human beings are ultimately driven by basic, primitive, animalistic motives. Specifically, he argued that if you dig deep enough, it all boils down to two massive, overwhelming primal drives: eros and thanatos. Sex and aggression, the life-creating drive and the death-dealing destructive drive.
Now, the expert delivering the lecture carefully navigates this historical legacy. He acknowledges his own theoretical bias, noting that as an integrative modern psychoanalytic thinker, he believes Freud's dual drive theory is incomplete. Modern psychology, backed by neuroscience, generally agrees that boiling the entirety of complex human behavior down to only sex and aggression is excessively reductive. We know there are other deeply rooted implicit motives: the fundamental wish for secure attachment, the drive for mastery and competence, the need for social connection.
But the lecturer absolutely insists that while Freud may have missed a few items on the list, his fundamental evolutionary premise was dead on target. We humans desperately narcissistically want to view ourselves as these elevated, purely cognitive, highly rational beings entirely separate from the animal kingdom. But neurologically, biologically, that is a complete fantasy.
It is a comforting delusion. The lecturer makes a stark, undeniable biological comparison to shatter that delusion. He points to the human brainstem, the oldest, deepest part of our neurological hardware. This is the center that regulates our most basic motivations: our hunger, our thirst, our body temperature, and our raw, primal urges. From a structural and functional standpoint, the human brainstem is nearly indistinguishable from the brainstem of a sheep.
We share the exact same primal engine as a sheep. Over millions of years of messy evolution, nature didn't rip out that primitive animal engine and replace it with a clean, logical computer. Nature just built a shiny, massively complex new cognitive structure, the prefrontal cortex, right on top of the old engine. We evolved an incredibly sophisticated system designed to regulate, socialize, and cleverly hide those base animal drives, but the drives themselves were never removed. They're still running in the basement.
And this, the lecturer argues, is where Freud's enduring, irreplaceable value to psychology truly lies. Freud refused to ignore the basement. The lecturer offers a humorous but incredibly sharp observation to illustrate this, something we can refer to as the mother rule.
I love the mother rule. It's such a great heuristic for evaluating information. The lecturer points out that if you want to, you can go to a university library right now, pull down a towering stack of modern, highly sanitized, peer-reviewed academic psychology textbooks, read tens of thousands of pages, and you'll almost never encounter the word genitals. You will rarely read an unvarnished account of the messy, chaotic, often destructive realities of human reproduction. You will struggle to find a clean, cognitive explanation for the bizarre, primal, bloodthirsty urge that drives millions of civilized people to sit in an arena and cheer wildly while watching two humans physically batter each other to a bloody pulp in a boxing match. Modern academic psychology often prefers to act as if the dark, taboo, socially unacceptable, and violent parts of human nature simply do not exist.
Freud, however, for all his methodological flaws and Victorian biases, steered directly into that darkness. He looked unflinchingly at the taboo. He built his entire theory around the deeply uncomfortable behaviors and urges that polite society works so desperately hard to repress and deny. This raises an important question, which the lecturer beautifully articulates as his closing argument. He proposes that if you encounter a comprehensive psychological theory of human behavior, and that theory is so clean, so rational, and so polite that you would feel perfectly comfortable discussing its tenets over tea with your elderly mother, it is almost certainly a terrible, fundamentally inaccurate theory, because actual human beings are not clean, rational, or polite. We are messy, we are constantly driven by socially inappropriate thoughts, we harbor dark urges, and we are torn apart by deep-seated unconscious conflicts. A sanitized theory of mind is missing the true, terrifying reality of human nature.
Okay, we have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. Let's briefly recap the massive arc of this journey. We started by looking at a celibate priest pulling a decaying fish out of his own unconscious feels about his mother. We watched as rigid lab scientists desperately tried to disprove the clinical psychoanalysts, only to end up inadvertently proving that our brains are secretly spelling words, sweating in absolute terror at the mere sound of the word dog, and actively choosing our favorite music, all completely in the dark, outside of our conscious control.
We examine Shedler's work, proving how our physical bodies will violently betray our conscious claims of being stress-free, suffering cardiovascular strain while we smile and insist we are fine. And we explored McClellan's longitudinal data, showing how the implicit motives forged in the pre-verbal crucible of our childhood silently steer the massive trajectory of our careers and quietly sabotage our marriages, completely overriding our conscious 1990s intellectual ideals.
So what does this all mean? It has been a wild, paradigm-shifting ride through the source material. And now, as we always do, we want to turn this directly to you, the listener. We want to challenge you to look at your own daily life, your own routines, through this unsettling new lens. Think about your day today. When you feel a sudden, entirely unexplained preference for a person you just met, or a sudden aversion to a new environment. When you experience a vague, heavy unease, much like patient HM, but you absolutely cannot articulate why you feel sad. Or, perhaps most importantly, when you find yourself continually, bafflingly, failing to live up to a goal you so earnestly, consciously set for yourself on New Year's Day.
When you encounter that resistance, you have to ask yourself, is it simply a superficial lack of willpower or discipline? Or is your shiny, new conscious mind quietly losing a brutal tug-of-war to a much older, deeper, immensely powerful implicit motive that you are terrified to acknowledge?
It is entirely possible, and frankly highly probable, that your body and your unconscious networks are keeping a meticulous score that your conscious mind refuses to read. And we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to chew on long after this deep dive ends. We talked extensively about how our deepest, most powerful engines, our implicit needs for absolute power or for desperate intimacy, are locked into our neurological hardware during our pre-verbal childhood years, through experiences as mundane, terrifying, and primal as toilet training at age 2.
If we accept that as empirical truth, if the core engine of what we fundamentally want out of existence was built, fueled, and turned on before we even possessed the vocabulary to describe it,
Then how much of your adult, highly rational decision-making is actually rational at all? Think about the major pillars of your life. When you passionately argue for a specific political belief, or when you logically explain to a friend exactly why you took that high-stress job, or when you carefully justify why you ended that long-term relationship, are you actually using reason to arrive at a conclusion? Or is your highly evolved, incredibly articulate, conscious brain merely acting as an expensive PR firm, desperately inventing clever, logical, socially acceptable excuses to justify a primitive decision that the animal in your basement already made decades ago? It's something to seriously think about the next time you are absolutely 100% certain you know exactly why you are doing something. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mind. We will see you next time.